All right, so in this video, we're going to look at Chapter 13, which is disorders of red blood cells. So remember, red blood cells are essentially a type of cell that lack most organelles and rather just contain a lot of hemoglobin. In fact, each red blood cell has about 250 million molecules of hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is a globular protein made of alpha and beta chains. The alpha and beta chains each contain a heme group, and the heme is essentially an organic molecule that contains a central iron atom. Now, this iron is essentially what can bind with gases like oxygen, carbon dioxide, and carbon monoxide. And because our hemoglobin has 4 heme groups, the question here says how many molecules of oxygen can be carried by one molecule of hemoglobin? Well, if each hemoglobin molecule has 4 heme, then you can carry 4 oxygen atoms per hemoglobin molecule. In fact, each red blood cell contains 250 million molecules of hemoglobin, so that's about 1 billion molecules of oxygen that can be carried by a single red blood cell. Now, iron is an important nutrient in the synthesis of hemoglobin, and so we're going to receive iron through our diet. It's actually absorbed through the small intestine and can be stored in the intestinal cells. But once it's actually absorbed, it's transported into our bloodstream and bound to a molecule called transferrin. Now, transferrin is a glycoprotein that helps to safely transport iron in the bloodstream. The problem with transporting free iron, if it weren't bound to transferrin, is that iron could generate free radicals. And so free iron is actually toxic to your cells. So what we need then is actually a glycoprotein transferrin to transport that iron and then carry it on over to organs like your bone marrow, your liver, and spleen. Now, your liver and spleen can store that excess iron until it can be used. And what's pretty cool then is that you can carry this iron over to bone marrow, where it's actually used in the synthesis of red blood cells. Now, these red blood cells will travel out throughout the bloodstream for approximately 90 days or so. But effectively, because they lack organelles, they're going to have a pretty short lifespan. Like the lifespan is about 90 days for a red blood cell. So it's the spleen and the liver that can break down damaged red blood cells and then recycle those components. So what the spleen and the liver can both do is break down red blood cells, remove hemoglobin, and essentially break that into heme and globin. The globin protein can be recycled back into amino acids and then transported in the bloodstream. And then that heme, you can extract the iron from that and then transport that back into the blood, which then can be used by marrow again. Now, what's pretty cool too is that the heme here is also transported in the bloodstream, where your liver can use that heme to help make bile. So erythropoiesis is actually a process where due to decreased blood oxygen levels, like hypoxia, your kidneys have little O2 sensors, and when oxygen levels get too low, your kidneys can release the hormone erythropoietin. And it's a hormone released by your kidneys that essentially travels through the bloodstream and stimulates your bone marrow to produce more red blood cells. And so the purpose of this then is to help to try to reverse this decrease in blood oxygen. And the idea here is that if you can increase your red blood cell count, you can increase the oxygen carrying capacity of your blood, which then can raise blood oxygen levels. So this question here says, why would a man receiving chemotherapy for cancer develop anemia? So anemia is going to be an insufficient ability to transport oxygen in the bloodstream, and this could come from a lack of red blood cells or a dilution of red blood cells. So there's different types of anemia. We have relative and absolute anemia. Absolute anemia would be actual loss of red blood cells. Relative anemia would be where your blood volume is so high and you have fluid overload that your relative red blood cell concentration is now lower, although your absolute red blood cell count may not have changed. If you have way too much plasma in your blood, that can actually lead to relative anemia. So the question here, though, is why would a man receiving chemotherapy for cancer develop anemia? Well, would that be relative or absolute anemia? Well, remember, chemotherapeutic drugs target cells that divide a lot. So it's also going to affect your bone marrow. And because red blood cells have to be replenished pretty frequently, they come from cells that are pretty consistently dividing. So chemotherapeutic agents have effects on red blood cell numbers, and that would be absolute anemia, which is going to be due to the chemotherapeutic agent preventing the production of red blood cell growth. So then the next question here says, why would a man with renal failure develop anemia? And again, would that be absolute or relative anemia? Well, it could be both, right? Because the kidneys are involved with helping to get rid of excess fluid. Well, a man with renal failure is not going to be able to produce urine as well, so there's going to have fluid overload, which then could dilute your blood and have more plasma as a relative percent of your total blood volume. And that could actually lead to relative anemia, where your red blood cells are kind of diluted out. But it could also, renal failure can also lead to absolute anemia, because remember, the kidneys release the hormone erythropoietin, which then stimulates red blood cells to grow in bone marrow. And that would prevent, if you had renal failure, you couldn't release erythropoietin, so then you couldn't actually stimulate red blood cell growth. So it could also lead to absolute anemia. So red blood cells only last for about 120 days or so, 90 to 120 days. And what's interesting, though, is that metabolic activity decreases with age. And we see then as a result weakened membranes, right? And so red blood cells break more easily. Phagocytes from the spleen and liver and bone marrow can digest and destroy these damaged red blood cells. And then heme is processed into bilirubin, which is incorporated into bile. But then you recycle that iron for later use by other newly maturing red blood cells. Now, what's also pretty cool too is you can actually reabsorb this bilirubin along your digestive tract to be recycled back into heme as well. Now, we find then that in terms of destruction of red blood cells, conjugated bilirubin's water soluble; it's excreted into bile. Unconjugated bilirubin happens if red blood cells break down faster than bilirubin is removed. Then you find that it can build up in your tissues of your body, causing jaundice. Remember, jaundice is a yellowish cast of skin, which is due to an accumulation of bilirubin in those tissues. It can also make other tissues appear more yellow, like the sclera or the white of your eyes as well. Now, the first type of anemia we'll talk about is hemolytic anemia. So hemolytic literally means to break down blood. And so hemolytic anemia would be where red blood cell destruction occurs more quickly than red cell production. And so hemoglobin binds to these haptoglobin and albumin proteins. And so if there's too much hemoglobin in the blood, it can lead to hemoglobinemia, which can make your plasma turn more red. And it's also excreted in the urine as hemoglobinuria. And so if you find hemoglobin in the urine, it's hemoglobinuria, and it makes your urine a darker color. Like sometimes it's kind of brownish. It could also be kind of purplish depending on the content of hemoglobin. But this in itself can also lead to renal failure, because this puts extra stress on the glomeruli of your kidneys to transport all this excess protein out of blood and into urine. Now, so some examples here. The question here says, why would a man with defective red blood cells develop hepatosplenomegaly? Well, hepato is liver, and splenomegaly is spleen, but megaly is enlargement. So if you have defective red blood cells, they're more likely to break down. And since the liver and spleen take care of damaged red blood cells, they're going to be working overtime, or kind of have a lot of stress to remove these damaged red blood cells from the bloodstream, and therefore, as an organ, they're going to get larger. And so hepatosplenomegaly is an interesting sign of red blood cell disease. Another one here says, why would a man with liver failure develop jaundice? Well, we learned how the liver is involved with basically helping to remove heme from blood, convert that into bilirubin, and that bilirubin is actually incorporated into bile. Now remember, bilirubin has kind of a greenish color, and that's what makes bile green. But if your liver's failing and you can't remove heme from blood, that heme can spontaneously break down into bilirubin within your tissues, and can actually make your tissues look more yellow. And that's how liver failure is associated with jaundice. But what's important to note, though, is that not all forms of jaundice are caused by liver failure. And so we'll come back to this in a future chapter. So this next question here says, why was malaria called blackwater fever? Well, remember, so malaria is actually caused by a parasite called Plasmodium falciparum, and there's other types of malarial parasites, or plasmodia. And essentially what this parasite does is it gets into your red blood cells and lives on hemoglobin. Now, part of the parasite's life cycle is to actually lyse out of red blood cells and then spread with all of its little progeny parasites into new red blood cells. Now, when you get the lysis of that red blood cell, it releases a lot of hemoglobin in the bloodstream, which then leads to hemoglobinuria, and then you end up with that in the in the urine, which can make your urine kind of dark. So malaria was called black water fever because of the hemoglobinuria that would actually make your urine be darker. We have actually some pretty good drugs that can target malaria now and prevent the hemoglobinuria that black water fever was named for. So another question here says red blood cells or erythrocytes are made in the blank and destroyed in the blank. So is it the kidneys or bone marrow that make red blood cells? Well, we know it's actually bone marrow, not the kidneys. And they're destroyed by the liver or spleen. Well, it's primarily the spleen. Now, the liver can break down some red blood cells, but as long as the spleen is functioning properly, that's going to be one of its major functions. So erythropoietin is made by the kidneys, and it stimulates red bone marrow production to make new red blood cells. And the spleen is what essentially takes care of damaged red blood cells for the most part. Now, some different causes of anemia could be things like blood loss, hemolysis, or impaired red blood cell production. Blood loss could lead to just absolute anemia, where you just lost a lot of red blood cells. Hemolysis means the breakdown of red blood cells, so this can actually be caused by a lot of diseases which could prevent the adequate structure of a red blood cell, so they're more likely to break down, and they break down more quickly than 120 days, so they don't last as long. Or they might just not be produced properly, or so you don't have an adequate production of red blood cells. So in order to have stable red blood cell numbers in your blood, you want to have a trade-off between red cell production and destruction, and they should be pretty well matched. If you're destroying red blood cells faster than they're produced, it's going to lead to anemia. If you're making red blood cells faster than they're destroyed, that can lead to polycythemia, which is essentially an overgrowth of red blood cells, and we'll talk about that later. So some of the different causes of anemia we see here would be things like iron deficiency anemia. This is an interesting disorder where, due to a lack of iron, and this can come from a variety of sources. It could be, a lack of dietary iron or inefficient iron transport. But iron deficiency anemia is where you still have, an adequate number of red blood cells. However, the red blood cells will be smaller and less colorful. They'll be smaller because they don't have as much hemoglobin, and they're not as red. We could say they're hypochromic. They'll be kind of more clear because, again, they don't have as much iron. So you find these microcytic hypochromic red blood cells with iron deficiency anemia. And this one's easily treatable with just, an increase in iron in diet or, conjugated iron in blood. Now, megaloblastic anemias, essentially we produce these large red blood cells that are unstable. They're more likely to rupture, and therefore you get an increase in destruction, which then leads to absolute anemia. We also get sickle cell anemia, and this is essentially a genetic disorder where these red blood cells are sickled shaped, and it's due to a mutation in the gene for hemoglobin. And when red blood cells take on this kind of sickle shape, they're weaker and they're more likely to break apart. And if you can compare that to normal red blood cells, they're actually kind of biconcave disc shape, which actually allows them to bend and squeeze through the smallest blood vessels of your body. But when they have the sickle shape, they're more likely to break apart. So we have a scenario here, and our scenario says a man had severe anemia and developed the following: weakness and fatigue, angina and tachycardia, sweating and pallor, and pain in his bone and sternum. And so the questions here, which are caused by a decreased red blood cell in O2, which are caused by compensation using the general adaptation syndrome, or which are actually caused by attempts to replace the red blood cells. So let's think about this list. If you have weakness and fatigue, what is that going to be caused by? Your body's compensatory mechanisms, your body's attempt to make new red blood cells, or a lack of red blood cells in O2? Well, that's going to be the latter, right? So red blood cells in O2, because they transport oxygen, and that's an essential nutrient for your body's tissues. If you have low O2, it's going to lead to weakness and fatigue, right? And then angina is essentially like heart pain, and tachycardia is your heart's fast heart rate. And so if you think about this, you guys, is that angina, you're going to get heart pain from low O2 levels because it's going to lead to a little bit of cell injury, but this doesn't cause any long-term damage to the heart. So angina is a sort of intermittent heart pain. Tachycardia is just a heart rate faster than 100 beats per minute, So we're saying it's abnormally fast, and this would definitely be a compensatory mechanism by your general adaptation syndrome, or GAS. That's tachycardia. Sweating and pallor would essentially be associated with an increase in, so sweating would be an increase in your sympathetic nervous system, right? So the ability to transport oxygen throughout your body. And then pallor, which is sort of the paleness of skin, would be more associated with low red blood cells and O2. And then pain in your bones and sternum. Well, the sternum is a place of red bone marrow, and certain bones also have red bone marrow. So if you're trying to produce a lot more red blood cells and your red bone marrow is like proliferating and growing, that can actually make your bones more painful. And so that one's going to be associated with this increased production of red blood cells. Now, there are some hemolytic anemias, and that's essentially where these red blood cells break down abnormally. This can come from membrane disorders or hemoglobinopathies, or even this G6PD deficiency. Now, some different membrane disorders could be things like hereditary spherocytosis or acquired hemolytic anemias or hemolytic disease of a newborn. These are both disorders where the cytoskeleton of the red blood cell is weaker, so these cells are more likely to break apart. Some of these are actually genetic in nature. Now, the hemoglobinopathies like sickle cell disease and thalassemia are disorders of hemoglobin, and they're heritable. Now, it leads to malformed hemoglobin, which compromises the structural integrity of red blood cells. So sickle cell disease, it's associated with a mutation in the gene for hemoglobin, makes red blood cells more sickle-shaped. But that's because of malformed hemoglobin that changes the shape of that and makes the cell all sickled. And then thalassemia, which is like sickle cell disease, but it's a different mutation, and it's also associated with different demographics worldwide. And there's different subtypes we'll talk about later. And this G6PD deficiency, it can also lead to weakening of red blood cells, so they're more likely to rupture. So, essentially what we find here is glutamic acid is actually going to be converted to valine with sickle cell anemia. So what's interesting here is that for sickle cell anemia, it's a point mutation. So we're saying here that you've actually switched the types of base pairs that you'd find in the gene for hemoglobin, and it's only one base pair that's switched, but that's enough to change the entire amino acid that's associated with this codon here, whereas normally it should be glutamic acid. After the point mutation, it becomes valine. Now, by having a new amino acid in this place, it changes the structure of hemoglobin such that when red blood cells become deoxygenated, they take on this sickle shape, right? Now, it's reversible, so once the red blood cells get enough oxygen again, they'll go back to a new shape. But the problem here, though, is that when these red blood cells take on a sickled shape, they don't bend as easily. They're more likely to get stuck. So you see clots. If they don't bend as easily, it puts a lot of stress on the red blood cells, so they don't live as long. And sometimes they become irreversibly sickled, which actually causes these red blood cells to become adhesive. So they actually adhere to vessel walls, causing hemolysis and vessel occlusion. This can lead to tissue ischemia, which is very painful, and also infarction, which can lead to death of local areas of tissue, and that's also painful. Now, individuals with sickle cell anemia need to maintain adequate oxygen levels to avoid the sickling of the red blood cells. And if they get low oxygen, then this whole cascade happens, which can lead to pain, ischemia, and possibly even in death of tissues around the body. So some of the consequences of sickle cell anemia would be things like, well, these sickle cell cells are more likely to be destroyed, right? Now that leads to things like jaundice and pigmented gallstones, where jaundice is just the accumulation of bilirubin in the tissues, and that makes sense from the breakdown of these red blood cells. And then these gallstones are going to accumulate because of excess heme trying to be secreted by your bile, or excreted rather. Sickled cells can also block capillaries, leading to acute pain. Can also lead to infarctions that cause damage to organs like your liver, spleen, heart, kidneys, eyes, and even bones. Can lead to pulmonary infarctions, which can lead to acute chest syndrome and even respiratory failure, and even cerebral infarction, which can lead to stroke. So there's lots of consequences of sickle cell disease. So what this is showing then is just sort of the all of the sequelae or consequences of sickle cell disease. We find that stroke And retinal infarcts are a common consequence of those sickled cells causing vessel occlusions. We find that acute chest syndrome also results from vessel occlusions, as well as avascular necrosis of tissues like bone and your kidneys, as well as your spleen. You can get the accumulation of a lot of gallstones as well, which can lead to a whole host of problems like pancreatitis and even liver failure. We get iron overload as well. Remember, free iron is toxic to your body, but this iron has a tendency to accumulate in both your heart and your liver, and this can put even excess stress on these organs, possibly even leading to irreversible cell injury. And it can also cause skin ulcers, where in skin, if you have little local areas of infarct, or basically, it can lead to necrosis, where you essentially have dead tissue from ischemia. And those ulcers are sort of a sign of ischemia that can be caused from sickle cell disease. So what's interesting though too is that sickle cell anemia is actually more common in people of like African descent and in areas of where the malarias were commonly affected. And the reason being is that malaria, it's a plasmodium that actually infects red blood cells. But if you have sickle cell disease, it actually protects you against malaria because it makes it more difficult for the parasite to get in your red blood cells. So we're talking about how this mutation here, it causes this whole host of problems, but also protects against a life-threatening parasite. So it makes sense why it's more commonly found in areas that have a lot more malaria. So in terms of inheritance of sickle cell anemia, it's actually a recessive disorder. So if you are heterozygous, you can have sickle cell trait, which you just kind of have minor signs and symptoms. But if you're homozygous for this recessive allele, then you have sickle cell disease. And it follows the same inheritance patterns of a typical autosomal recessive disease. So the question here then is that if you have a man that's heterozygous for sickle cell anemia and a wife who has sickle cell disease, so that means that she's homozygous, what percentage of children will have the disease? Well, all you have to do is just set up a simple plot here, and all you have to do is just basically, Mendelian plot, and all you have to do is just put the alleles side by side to figure this out. So, in a population where the gene frequency of sickle cell allele is 10%, assuming the gene is equally common in males and females, what percentage of the next generation will have sickle cell trait? Well, remember, sickle cell trait is where you only inherit one of those alleles. So our answer here is going to be at least 10%, because if you're saying that you have two parents that might have sickle cell traits where they just carry an allele, their children are going to have, there's a pretty good chance they're going to inherit that allele as well. So true or false here, it says patients with sickle cell anemia who also suffer from lung disease and are more prone to sickling. Is that true or false? We find that that's true, and we just talked about that in the previous slide where we said that sickle cell anemia can lead to hypoxia because of that sickling and leading to pulmonary disease. Now, it's an important exacerbating factor associated with increased sickling and vessel occlusion, and you can actually get respiratory failure from sickle cell blockage of blood vessels in the lungs. Now, remember, thalassemias are very similar to sickle cell. In fact, thalassemia is also common in individuals of Mediterranean descent, again, because of the whole malaria thing. And there's two types of thalassemias. We have alpha and beta thalassemia. Alpha thalassemia is actually going to be where you have a defective gene for the alpha chain of hemoglobin. There's about 1 or 4 defective genes that are associated with alpha thalassemia, and it affects both fetal and adult hemoglobin. In a fetus, it's gamma-4 hemoglobin that is formed. In an adult, it's beta-4 hemoglobin that can form. And then for the beta thalassemia, we find that the defective gene for beta chain synthesis, hence the name, and there's over 100 different mutations that are associated with beta thalassemia. Now, it affects only adult hemoglobin, and the alpha hemoglobin can still form here. Now, the scenario says here, a woman with thalassemia has been treated with transfusion since childhood. She has pain, pale skin and gums, fatigue and headaches. Her jaw is enlarged and she has 2 recent leg fractures. She has Heinz bodies and her liver is enlarged and she has jaundice and liver failure. So which of these are signs and symptoms are due to anemia, which is due to compensatory erythropoiesis, and which is due to the treatment? Well, pale skin, gums, fatigue, and headaches would be associated with anemia, right? Now, pallor of the skin would make sense because if you have essentially low hemoglobin content in the blood due to limited blood flow to the skin, that's going to make the skin appear more pale. Same with the gums as well. Instead of having pink gums, the gums can be kind of blanched white or kind of gray in appearance. The fatigue and headaches would come from a lack of O2 to the brain. Her jaw is enlarged, and she's had 2 recent leg fractures. Well, this would come from the compensatory erythropoiesis. Because if her red blood cell count is low from these cells rupturing, it would make sense then that the compensatory erythropoiesis would cause her mandible to enlarge because of that red bone marrow growth, and the leg fractures can come from weakening of bone due to an increase in bone marrow sort of pressure inside of the femur. It says her liver's enlarged and she has jaundice and liver failure. Well, the enlarged liver would actually be due to the anemia itself, because the liver is trying to get rid of those damaged red blood cells. And then she has jaundice and liver failure. Well, that's come from the anemia as well, because the jaundice here is going to be associated with liver failure, and liver might be failing due to just sort of increased stress from trying to remove those damaged red blood cells. Now, there's also, red blood cell disorders that come from deficient red blood cell production. So we have things like iron deficiency anemia, megaloblastic anemias, which can be due to folic acid deficiency or vitamin B12 deficiency, which we call pernicious anemia. There's aplastic anemia, which is bone marrow suppression, and this is a common sequela of leukemias and lymphomas that we talked about earlier. And then chronic disease anemias could come from things like inflammation or even renal failure. So blood loss or deficiency of red blood cells could come from sort of excess loss of these red blood cells. And if you have low iron in the diet, it can lead to deficient iron, such that you can't produce enough red blood cells. You could have low hemoglobin and hematocrit associated with anemia as well, or low serum iron and ferritin. With iron deficiency anemia, we see hypochromic and microcytic red blood cells or erythrocytes. They're also going to be poikilocytes because of their irregular shape, and you get anisocytosis because of their increase in size. Now, other types of anemias we have, things like vitamin B12 and folic acid deficiencies, can actually impair proper DNA synthesis, so that you don't get enough red blood cells, and for the ones that are produced, they're going to be excessively large. And these erythrocytes are large with often kind of more oval shape. They're also going to be weaker and more likely to break apart. So which type of deficiency is caused by pernicious anemia? So pernicious anemia is due to iron, vitamin B6, vitamin B12, or folic acid deficiency. That's going to be vitamin B12, and so that's pernicious anemia. Now, pernicious anemia could actually be due to not just low vitamin B12 in the diet, it could also be due to destruction of the gastric mucosa. We learned back in the digestive chapter how some of the cells of your stomach lining secrete a glycoprotein called, they call it intrinsic factor, which helps to bind with vitamin B12 such that you can actually absorb it along your digestive tract. But if you have a disease that affects the gastric mucosa, like inflammatory bowel disease or chronic irritation like alcoholism, can actually lead to vitamin B12 deficiency, which can lead to anemia because you block your body's ability to absorb that vitamin B12. Now, another scenario here says a boy presents with pallor, weakness, increased respiratory and heart rate, enlarged spleen and liver, yellow skin and brown urine, and low red blood cell count. Does he have deficiency or hemolytic anemia? Well, if you have yellow skin and brown urine, that's probably going to be associated more with the hemolytic anemia. This is why it's going to, sort of cause a jaundice from a breakdown of those red blood cells and the deposition of bilirubin in the skin. We see that low red blood cell count also would correlate with hemolytic anemia. Increase in respiratory and heart rate would be part of the compensatory responses, or GAS, associated with hypoxia. Same with weakness and pallor are going to come from the symptoms of the anemia itself. So we find then there's an increase in red blood cell count and hematocrit greater than 50%. We call this polycythemia vera. And so relative polycythemia is actually a loss of plasma volume that makes your red blood cell count relatively greater So it makes your blood a little more viscous, a little more sticky, and more difficult to pump. And absolute polycythemia is actually an absolute increase in red blood cell mass. And so the primary cause of this is actually neoplastic. And we talked about how polycythemia vera is actually a myeloid neoplasm. It's actually one of the signs of myeloid neoplasm is excessive red blood cell production. But secondary polycythemia can also come from an increase in erythropoietin. So individuals who maybe live at extremely high altitude could have secondary polycythemia because if you live at high altitude, you have low O2 in your blood because of low oxygen in the air, which means that your compensatory response then is to produce more erythropoietin. That's going to stimulate your red blood cells to grow more, and that can actually lead to polycythemia if you live at very high